Hi, I'm Gary, and this is EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. And on the show today, we'll be looking at a topic I hear about from time to time, which is the emergency long-distance EV journey. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. Our main topic of discussion today is focused on doing emergency journeys in an electric vehicle. Now, I was chatting with an acquaintance of mine recently, a Tesla Model 3 driver of around 5 years, who said that he was going to sell it and get a hybrid. And when I asked him why, he trotted out a number of reasons, none of which were entirely valid. I think I've done my bit for the environment, etc. But one that he did come out with, which I found interesting, was the emergency journey scenario. And it looks a little bit like this. My daughter is at the University of Edinburgh and I live in Maidstone in Kent. And what if I have to make an emergency journey to Edinburgh to see my daughter and my EV is only at 30% state of charge? Now, I've heard variations of this a couple of times over the years. And let me start by recognising that it's absolutely a genuine concern. If our children or other loved ones are in danger or suffering or need us, then the last thing we need are things that can slow us down from getting there. But this scenario does tend to break down just a little bit if you look at the detail around it. The key thing is that it assumes that if you had a fossil fuel car, you would be able to do that journey in a much shorter time, and that it's just the charging that would slow you down. Now, to illustrate why this is a little bit specious as an argument, I want to give you a slightly alternative version of things. Now, let's have a look at the fossil fuel version of this. I have a car with a third of a tank of fuel and I need to do a 500-mile journey across the country. So I set off immediately. At some point, I'm going to have to stop. Let's assume I just stop, I fill up and I head off. Let's assume that the petrol station's open, that there's no queues to either to fill or to pay. So I'm in and out in 10 minutes. I'm then going to travel from Maidstone in Kent to Edinburgh, which is a journey of, without stopping or slowing down, 430 miles and a journey time of around 8 hours as a minimum. So let's set aside the dangers of travelling that far without stopping, both from a health and a fatigue point of view. The other thing that you need to remember about this is that it's not going to be 8 hours. That's assuming you were travelling at the speed limit, and part of that journey is around the M25 and across the Dartford crossing, which, even as I record this on a Sunday afternoon in summer, there are delays. So you're not going to be doing that journey in the time that you think you're going to be doing it in. But it's also assuming that you're doing this when there are no accidents, no rush hour traffic, no diversions for roadworks, and you're hoping that the M25 is not closed, all of which have happened in the last 6 months on this route. In reality, your journey is going to be more like less than 8 hours, probably 10 hours. So let's look at the same journey with a Tesla. You can do the same route using only Tesla superchargers and 3 stops of around 30 minutes each. Now, other than the first stop, which tops up the 30% charge, the other 2 stops are at least 2 hours apart. Total travel time is a little under 9 hours, and you arrive in a fresher, more relaxed state than if you were having to do the complete journey without stopping. Now, if your car had started with 80% in Maidstone, your journey would have been even quicker, with 3 stops of around 15 minutes and an 11-minute top-up for a total of 54 minutes stationary and a travel time of 8 hours, 11 minutes. Now, if there's time, you could pop to the nearest Tesla supercharger in Maidstone and spend 30 minutes there, and that makes your next 2 stops around 30 minutes each, again, 2 hours apart. Now, if you had set off with a 100% full battery, your travel time would have been 8 hours and 5 minutes with 51 minutes of charging time. In other words, the time saving in this Tesla between setting off with 100% state of charge and 30% state of charge is a mere 49 minutes, which is about the time it took me to travel from central London to Hammersmith last Sunday around 6:30 p.m, which was a distance of about 10 miles. Now, if you're thinking that 49 minutes is going to make a life and death difference, then bear in mind that the last journey I took from Reading to Birmingham, a 2-hour journey in which I didn't need to charge at all, delays and traffic added 40 minutes to my travel time. Friend of the podcast and my London, Brighton, Amsterdam EV Rally co-driver Tim Rolt-Smith was with his partner in Exeter recently when she learned that her mother was gravely ill, Her mother lives in St Andrews, Scotland. They jumped in his Model S and headed off, stopping for a break and charging as they went. Neither of them were unduly stressed about the journey, and the 500-mile trip took around 10 hours. Now, what this means is that using the family emergency excuse when it comes to electric cars, it's something of a red herring. This is a factor that plays into your insecurity about EVs when it really shouldn't. Now, the other aspect of this is the actual likelihood of the scenario occurring. Imagine the set of circumstances in which someone has been driving the car all day long or has done a long-distance journey, has arrived home with a relatively low state of charge, and before any home charging or public charging on local AC units can take place, there's an immediate need to do a long-distance journey there and then. Now, is that scenario more or less likely than someone having a puncture in their vehicle and not being able to swap the tyre out? Because remember, we don't have spare tyres anymore, and punctures need to be taken to a nearby tyre shop for replacement. According to the AAA and RAC, punctures and 12-volt battery issues are the most common cause of vehicle collapse in the UK, regardless of fuel type. Now, is that scenario more or less likely than having someone send their vehicle in for a service and not having the car until the car comes back from being at the service, which is a situation that you can easily remove if you use a company such as Cleveland EV Mobile, who come to your house to service your car? Is that scenario more or less likely than living somewhere in the north of Scotland, where petrol stations close at 6:30 or 7 p.m. at night and often only operate 6 days per week? What happens when you need to do an emergency journey at 7 a.m. Sunday morning and you're short of petrol? Now, I put it to you that the number of instances in which people have failed to reach loved ones in time due to having to stop and charge an EV are so small as to be almost zero. Now, I further put it to you that these instances are heavily outweighed by the number of instances in which traffic, roadworks, a flat tyre, an accident have delayed people to the point where they've missed a loved one's final moments. Now, I think we also need to consider what we mean when we talk about getting there in time. If the loved one's on the point of death and the delay means the difference between getting to see and speak to them before they pass or not, then obviously any delay can be seen as disastrous. But I also think that if a delay means the difference between getting to an injured or distressed child in 5.5 hours, or 6 hours, or even 7 hours if the charging aspect is included, that's probably the least of your concerns. But I would point out that delays on the UK roads are pretty much guaranteed nowadays. Only recently I was heading down to do some work on the south coast of England as I passed the Winchester junction on the M3 at 5:30 in the morning. A truck had ridden up on one of those concrete bollards used to separate carriageways on a contraflow, and it had ended up blocking the motorway completely in the northbound carriageway, whilst also leaning over at a precarious angle, meaning it wasn't easy to clear without potentially tipping it over onto the carriageway. I tracked the M3 for the rest of the day, and I found that there was between 35 and 70 minutes of delay on that stretch for pretty much 12 hours as they diverted traffic at the Winchester exit over the roundabout and back onto the motorway at the other side. I wonder how many people were on urgent missions of mercy in that queue. Of course, the other issue with this scenario is that it implies that this is an issue for any parent or child with elderly parents with an EV. But again, the scenario is very specific. It involves a long-distance journey, in this case Kent to Edinburgh, 450 plus miles, and the implication that because of this long distance, someone would need to spend a long time charging. But the reality is probably different on multiple levels. What if the journey is only 150 miles? Even a short-range EV could cover that from a 30% state of charge with a stop of, 15-20 minutes. What if the journey's in an ultra-rapid charging car such as a Porsche Taycan or an 800-volt Hyundai or Kia? Again, the charging time would be minimal. Essentially, it would be longer than just filling with petrol, assuming there are no queues to fill up at your local petrol station. But it's not going to be anything like the hour, 2 hours that people believe a charge will take. Of course, the other issue that I'm not taking into consideration here is the emotional stress associated with a journey such as this. If the journey is urgent, which we assume it is due to the nature of the emergency and the fact that we're concerned about time wasted charging, anything that can slow down or prevent you from making that journey in the shortest time possible is going to cause stress and distress. I recognise that and I understand that. But at the same time, as I've already noted, these stresses, the delays and issues are not necessarily EV related. anything that can cause a delay can be of concern. Roadworks, traffic, an accident, a detour or diversion, a queue at the petrol station. Focusing on the EV aspect of this is probably creating an issue where one doesn't really exist. Now, the big elephant in the room here, of course, is why are we actually using cars to do journeys like that? If we take it as reasonable that time is the key issue here, and that by definition, if you need to get to a loved one as quickly as possible, money's not an issue, then surely it would be quicker to take the train. Sure, it'd be more expensive, sometimes a lot more expensive once you booked a journey, leaving pretty much immediately. But looking at the train timetables, the journey from Maidstone to Edinburgh would take 6 hours, station to station. And yes, there are a couple of changes to make. And yes, you're at the vagaries of national rail services. But if time's your main driver, surely a train's easier. Let's consider someone living in central London wanting to get to Edinburgh. The road journey is 7.5 hours with no stops. That's a petrol car that has a large enough tank to cover the 400 miles without needing to stop. The train journey, direct and with no changes, is as short as 4 hours 22 minutes. So in summary, yes, there's a valid concern that having to stop and charge your EV in an emergency could delay you. But there are valid concerns related to all aspects of delays due to driving, most of which are completely outside your control. The chances of a specific situation occurring where a vehicle is in such a low state of charge that having to stop on a long journey would mean the difference between life and death are phenomenally small. Finally, stopping to charge an EV is not something that takes all day, despite what some naysayers will have you believe. Quick and often is a good way of charging. Several short stops to take advantage of the charging curve when your car charges at its fastest can decrease charging times. Alternatively, slow and infrequent can work if you decide to stop for something to eat, for example, while you charge. Public transport is also a quicker alternative on many long-distance journeys, and it's more relaxing because you can do things on the way rather than having to focus 100% on the driving. So what do you think? Have you had instances where having to stop and charge has delayed you to such a point that it's caused an issue? If it has, have you also had times where things other than charging have caused you issues? Traffic, accidents, diversions, vehicle problems? Let me know. info@evmusings.com. It's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with you listeners. Trees and fungi work together underground to store a huge amount of carbon and help fight climate change. Worldwide, some 13 billion tons of carbon dioxide flow from plants to mycorrhizal fungi every year, which is about a third of humanity's emissions from fossil fuels. Not to mention the carbon dioxide that help trees capture by growing big and strong. The Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, or SPUN, has launched the Underground Atlas, an interactive tool that maps mycorrhizal fungi diversity around the world, helping scientists protect them better. Protecting fungi is key because they keep soil healthy and support plants, but many live outside protected areas and face threats from climate change. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. See what charge points are available right now with live availability and unrivaled UK charge point coverage at your fingertips. Pay at thousands of charge points within the app or with the ZapMap charging card. Join over 1 million EV drivers, download ZapMap and charge with confidence. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticism or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks, So You've Gone Electric, recently updated, and So You've Gone Renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging now if you're listening, and probably sat on the sofa looking at this on the phone if you're on YouTube. But if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop a review in iTunes or like, comment and subscribe in YouTube. It really helps me out. Thanks. If you reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.peaceguide.social with the words quick and often, hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks as always to my co-founder Simon. There's another week here where he's keeping himself to himself. Thanks for listening. Bye.